Tony Soprano gets all the headlines. The panic attacks, the explosions, the iconic outbursts that make everyone feel like they understand him. Fine, he is terrifying in the loud, obvious way. But here's the question the series quietly dares people to answer. What if the coldest killer in The Sopranos isn't Tony at all? Because Tony's violence is emotional. It's reactive. It comes with speeches, excuses, rage, and a whole performance of justification afterward. Silvio Dante doesn't bother with any of that. Silvio kills like he's closing a file. No theatrics, no meltdown, no moral debate. Just a problem, a plan, and a clean removal. And that's exactly why he's more dangerous. The show dresses him up as comic relief. The scowl, the sarcasm, the steady hand in the back room. So it's easy to mistake him for the reasonable one. But pay attention to who gets sent when a situation can't involve mistakes. Informants, internal betrayals, people who know too much. The jobs where delegation creates witnesses, and witnesses create indictments. This is not a story about the loudest monster in the room. It's about the professional one. The guy who can sit at the table, crack a remark, and then, without changing his expression, erase someone from the ledger like it was always scheduled. So the real question is simple. If Silvio is supposedly just the consigliere, why does he keep showing up when someone needs to disappear? Silvio Dante is routinely presented as the calm executive in the back room, the consigliere, the strategic whisperer, the man who can translate a grievance into a policy memo and a policy memo into a payoff. Then the series repeatedly reminds everyone, often without warning, that the steady hand is also perfectly willing to become the hand that pulls the trigger. The confusion is predictable. The title suggests distance and insulation, not face-to-face violence. Yet the show keeps staging Silvio as both boardroom counsel and field operative, as if the job description is less a hierarchy than a suggestion politely ignored whenever a crisis arrives. In the classic Mafia mythology borrowed from prestige cinema, a consigliere maintains plausible deniability as a structural principle. The point is not that he is too refined to kill, but that he is too valuable to risk. He coordinates, he negotiates, he absorbs emotion and emits strategy. When blood must be spilled, he authorizes it. He does not perform it. The Godfather's Tom Hagen can help orchestrate violence without ever becoming the man in the doorway. The distance is not cowardice, it is architecture. The organization survives because its most essential pieces are not the ones splattered across a kitchen floor. The Sopranos, naturally, has very little interest in being a museum exhibit. It prefers late-stage reality. The era when federal statutes like RICO changed the cost of delegation, when the old glamour has been replaced by surveillance, paranoia, and an endless management problem called potential cooperation. In that climate, outsourcing a sensitive task does not merely spread risk, it manufactures a future witness. A lower-level shooter who knows too much is a bargaining chip waiting to be cashed. A consigliere who keeps clean by delegating every ugly detail is also building a paper trail of liabilities, with legs, mouths, and attorneys. That logic goes a long way toward explaining why Silvio gets his hands dirty. If a job is truly delicate, informants, internal betrayal, the kind of cleanup that cannot tolerate improvisation, then the safest operative is not the hungriest, it is the most trusted. Delegation is exposure. In a shrinking, decaying organization, exposure is a habit that gets people arrested. So Silvio ends up doing the kind of work that supposedly does not belong to his department, while still acting as if it does not. The line he gives after a killing, an almost bureaucratic outside his department, lands as an irony rather than an excuse, because the show keeps confirming that department boundaries are mostly decorative. Pragmatism, however, is only half the story, because the series repeatedly frames Silvio as a specialist in eliminating problems that threaten the group's integrity. That includes suspected informants like Jimmy Altieri, liabilities like Adriana Lacerva, and traitors like Bert Gervasi, in a moment when loyalty becomes a matter of war, not etiquette. Even the almost incident involving the soccer coach belongs on the list, not because it is strategically similar, but because it signals an early willingness to make violence personal while still calling it business. The pattern is not random. It is organizational hygiene, carried out by someone who treats murder like a disinfectant. The timeline of his status matters as well. Early on, while the hierarchy is still settling and Junior's nominal leadership complicates everyone's job descriptions, Silvio behaves more like a senior soldier with managerial instincts than a formalized counselor. Later, once he is clearly positioned as Tony's right hand, the personal violence becomes harder to square with the ceremonial idea of a consigliere. The show's answer is blunt. This is not a ceremonial crew. This is not a dynasty. It is a mid-level operation running on improvisation, paranoia, and whatever manpower is still reliable this week. That is why comparisons to the Corleones function as accidental comedy. The Corleone family is a cinematic monarchy, a machine with rituals, stable ranks, and enough wealth to buy time. The DeMeo/Soprano crew is a smaller, harsher ecosystem where everyone is both executive and labor, where the same people who talk about tradition also panic about cash flow, and where the entire structure is regularly threatened by addiction, insecurity, and someone's latest existential breakdown. This is not the 1950s and tailored suits and carefully arranged symbolism. This is the 1990s and 2000s, where the romance has been replaced by a constant fear that the next phone call is either a wiretap or a subpoena. The Adriana situation demonstrates the late-stage logic at its most surgical. This is not a routine punishment delivered to a faceless enemy. It is a crisis inside the inner circle, unfolding quickly, with emotions, fear, and suspicion spiking in real time. Adriana is close enough to know names, dynamics, and routines. She is also frightened enough to be unpredictable. The goal is not merely to remove her. It is to remove her without creating a scene that leaks into law enforcement or destabilizes Christopher into open rebellion. The problem is not only that she knows things. The problem is that she knows things and is still human enough to react badly. Silvio fits that profile in a way an associate never could. Tony is too frightening and too symbolically charged. His presence would turn a controlled extraction into a panic response. Christopher cannot do it, which is both a moral weakness and a structural problem. Someone else in the circle might be plausible, but plausibility is not the same as certainty. Silvio provides certainty, trusted, present, authoritative, and unburdened by visible hesitation. The show's grim efficiency is that it treats the "who can get her into the car" question as seriously as the "who can finish the job" question. Because in this world, the first failure often creates the second. The brutality of that execution is what makes it unforgettable, and it is not the brutality of spectacle. It is the brutality of professionalism. There is no grand speech, no melodramatic conflict, no theatrical rage. There is only the administrative tone of a problem being closed. The scene lands as one of the coldest murders in the series, precisely because it strips away excuses. It is not an accident. It is not a fight gone wrong. It is not a passion crime. It is a planned disposal carried out by someone who looks like he is completing a shift report. That competence is also why Silvio's violence produces whiplash. For most of his screen time, he is comic relief, the sardonic operator, the man with the expressive scowl, the one who can puncture tension with a remark that sounds like it came from a cynical union rep. Then, with almost no transitional emotion, he becomes ice. Other characters are violent in ways that are loud, impulsive, or even pathetic. Their brutality is messy. It advertises insecurity. Silvio's brutality is clean. It is the kind that suggests rehearsal. The kind that makes the viewer realize the jokes were not softness, they were camouflage. The show uses that contrast as dark comedy, because Silvio frequently offers homicide as an all-purpose managerial fix. A problem appears, an annoyance, a betrayal, a rival, a liability. Silvio's instinct is often to reduce it to a binary, present or removed. The humor is that he delivers the suggestion with the same casual certainty someone might use to recommend replacing a faulty part. The unsettling part is that, in his world, it is a reasonable recommendation. The series keeps returning to this rhythm because it is a perfect satire of managerial thinking. Once a person is reframed as a problem, The most efficient solution becomes the one that ends all meetings permanently. Silvio's body count is not celebrated on screen, but it is obvious, undeniably. He is present at, orders, or personally carries out eliminations that make the crew's moral lectures sound like performance art. He recommends solutions with the enthusiasm of a man shopping for office supplies. Later, in exile or reinvention, the persona softens, proof that circumstances, not conscience, set the temperature. That recurring impulse also invites comparison with Tony's own violence, which is often reactive and self-justifying. Tony kills when insulted, humiliated, threatened, or emotionally cornered, and then builds a narrative that makes the act feel inevitable. Even when he commits a personal murder, it can read as a sudden collision of pride and rage. Silvio's violence is different. When he goes to someone's home to eliminate them, it is not a fight that happened to occur there. It is a scheduled task. The point is not to win an argument. It is to end a file. Bert Gervasi's end illustrates the point. The betrayal is taken personally, and the response is intimate. The killing is not outsourced. It is handled directly, in private, with the kind of close contact finality that does not allow for ambiguity. The message is not only betrayal is punished, but also betrayal is punished by the people you thought were your peers. It is difficult to watch because it is not chaotic. It is procedure, performed by someone who seems almost offended that procedure was required. The restaurant shooting sequence reinforces the theme with form as much as content. The staging toys with perception, with the sensation that reality briefly stutters. The moment can read, at first glance, like a technical glitch, because the show wants the audience to feel the disorientation of sudden death. People keep doing what they were doing until their brains catch up. It is a visual argument that the end does not announce itself with fanfare. It arrives as an interruption, and then the world awkwardly continues. Silvio's portfolio is not limited to pulling triggers. The arson at Artie Bucco's restaurant is a reminder that his operations skill set includes harm that is quieter but still devastating: sabotage, intimidation, and the destruction of a legitimate livelihood to settle an illegitimate dispute. He also sits at the center of one of the only enterprises the crew actually manages day to day. The strip club is not just a hangout. It is a business front, a revenue engine, and a place where problems become tangible: bodies, money, reputations, rather than abstract. In practical terms, Silvio functions less like a pure consigliere and more like an underboss who also happens to supervise the one venue where the crew's legitimacy can pretend it is real. This business lens helps explain another recurring obsession: the idea that Silvio is always counting. Consider the question of why he did not immediately wage war over Tracy's death after investing money into her dental work. In a purely predatory ledger, she is an asset, and her loss is an expense. In the immediate operational reality of the club, however, a dead body is a catastrophe. The first priority is containment. Remove the body, limit attention, control the narrative inside the crew, and avoid a police spectacle that threatens everyone's revenue. Moral outrage is optional. Operational survival is not. The show is careful to underline that his calm is not forgiveness. It is triage. As the manager of a public-facing business, he cannot afford emotional display that escalates the situation on the premises. The club is not officially a brothel, even if exploitation is the unspoken subtext. The difference matters in the show's logic, because it shapes what can be defended as business and what becomes indefensible. Silvio's priority is the enterprise's survival, not a theatrical vendetta over lost investment, and the show treats that pragmatism as both realistic and repellent. This is also why the question, "Does Silvio ever do anybody wrong?" is less innocent than it sounds. The confusion is produced by a narrative choice. The show rarely follows him home. Without domestic chaos on screen, without a solo episode of private despair, he can look comparatively stable. Stability, in this context, is not virtue. It is simply the absence of visible mess. His crimes are not ambiguous. He extorts, intimidates, orders violence, commits violence, and profits from exploitation. The show does not make him cleaner by keeping him off stage. It makes him quieter, and quiet is sometimes the most dangerous form of comfort. That narrative choice produces a second debate: whether the writers failed the character by not giving him a richer personal storyline. Silvio appears in a vast number of episodes, is credited as a major presence, and yet often functions as the dependable supporting pillar rather than a subject of exploration. Meanwhile, other characters receive extensive attention beyond mob business. Their homes, relationships, neuroses, side hustles, and vulnerabilities. Even figures treated as minor in the grand hierarchy sometimes enjoy more clearly defined arcs, simply because the show chooses to spend time showing who they are when the crew is not watching. There are practical explanations that make this omission look less like negligence. Steven Van Zandt was not a conventional actor when he was cast. The role was created to fit his persona, not to showcase emotional range. Writers naturally lean on what performs well, and he performs best as the sardonic ensemble presence, rather than the engine of a solitary psychological melodrama. He was also touring during the show's run, a scheduling reality that can make long, Silvio-centered arcs difficult. Even certain story beats associated with him have a pragmatic origin. Some material was reportedly shifted around based on other actors' availability, which is the kind of behind-the-scenes reality that quietly shapes what the audience later mistakes for intentional character design. There is also a blunt, less charitable theory: concerns about range. Silvio's on-screen persona is intentionally narrow, built around a signature expression, a stylized cadence, and a limited emotional palette. That is not inherently a flaw. It is a choice that serves the show's tone, but it can discourage writers from placing the character in scenes that demand raw exposure, grief that is not performative, fear that is not masked, or vulnerability that cannot be solved with a joke and a decision. A character can be compelling without crying on camera, but the show's imbalance is noticeable when everyone else is permitted a private life and Silvio is permitted a work schedule. Even so, deliberate restraint is not the same as narrative completeness. It is entirely possible to keep a character enigmatic while still providing enough texture to confirm he exists beyond the club and the back room. The series occasionally gestures in that direction. Brief glimpses of family early on, later season moments with his wife, the acknowledgement that he has obligations outside the crew, but it remains notably thin compared to the attention lavished on others. The result is a character who can feel like a function rather than a man, a reliable lever the plot pulls when it needs counsel, intimidation, or a clean removal. The strong silent type argument tries to turn that thinness into philosophy. Silvio is framed as loyal, dependable, and largely free of the personal demons that generate conflict. He does not sabotage Tony, does not spiral in public, does not broadcast insecurity with constant drama. Therefore, he does not require plot. The logic is tidy and flattering, and it fits the mob's own mythology about competence. It also ignores that the absence of chaos is not the absence of character. Silvio's drama is professionalized. He is not free of darkness. He is disciplined about how and when it appears. The series offers a glimpse of the cost of usefulness when Silvio briefly steps into the role of acting boss. The implication is clear. Being the strategist is not the same as being the sovereign. The top seat demands relentless exposure, constant triage, and a particular tolerance for pressure that corrodes health. Silvio can advise and execute and manage, but he is built for adjacency. He is the engine behind the curtain, not the performer who absorbs every spotlight. The show makes that point with minimal fuss, as if to say, even the competent ones have limits, and those limits do not make them virtuous, only realistic. One reason audiences remain fixated on him is that the show makes him cool, in a way that flirts with genre fantasy. The hair, the posture, the perpetual expression of measured disgust, it all reads like a stylized caricature from an older gangster comic strip, imported into a naturalistic drama and allowed to function anyway. That stylization is part of the appeal. It is also why a hypothetical Silvio-led version of the series feels structurally wrong. The central role requires emotional sprawl and contradiction. Depression, self-deception, tenderness, cruelty, and endless rationalization. Silvio is designed to be narrower, decisive, sardonic, and contained. Put him in the middle, and the show becomes something else, something more performative and less psychologically ugly. The fixation extends to small details that become accidental character beats, such as the sight of him reading practical how-to books. It is funny because it is domestic without being intimate, a glimpse of a life that remains stubbornly off-screen, reduced to a prop that confirms he does, at least in theory, exist outside the club. The show provides just enough of these moments to keep the mystique alive, and then retreats before the character becomes ordinary, because ordinary is the one thing the series refuses to grant these men without charging interest. That mystique becomes especially fragile when later franchise material rewires the timeline and turns him into a louder caricature. The original series strongly implies a shared youth with Tony, reminiscences of being chased away from adult games, a sense that they grew up in the same orbit, the familiarity of peers rather than the deference of a younger man to an elder. Later portrayals that depict Silvio as substantially older create an arithmetic problem that is too large to handwave. Continuity errors are not mortal sins, but when they distort a character's foundational relationship dynamics, they stop being trivia and start being a statement, intended or not, that precision was never the priority. The larger implication is that the creator's tolerance for fan concerns about lore and precision is uneven. In the original series, ambiguity often functions as an artistic choice, refusing closure to underline randomness or the limits of perception. In later expansions, ambiguity can look less like art and more like indifference. There's a difference between leaving a mystery unresolved and forgetting the timeline. One is a thesis, the other is inattentiveness wearing an expensive coat. All of this feeds the temptation to overinterpret Silvio, turning every fragment into evidence of hidden complexity. The simplest reading remains the most damning. He is exactly what the organization requires: loyalty without volatility, counsel without ego, force without hesitation. He is the employee of the month in a company whose product is coercion. That is why he feels more frightening than the loud psychopaths. The loud ones advertise their damage. Silvio's damage is integrated. He does not need to posture because his value is proven in results. That alignment also explains why his most violent moments can be both shocking and, in a grim way, oddly clean. In the Adriana execution, for example, debates about whether the killing could have been performed more gently miss the point. There is no gentle version of betrayal management. The only variation is the degree of cruelty layered on top of necessity, as defined by the crew. Silvio does not indulge in flamboyant sadism, but he also does not offer mercy. The coldness is the message. Even the reasonable ones are monsters, and the show refuses to let likability function as absolution. Some viewers insist on alternate fantasies. Adriana escaped, she ran far away, she reinvented herself. She was secretly spared and shipped off to some distant refuge. These daydreams are understandable, if only because the scene is so brutal it triggers denial as a coping mechanism. The series, however, is not built for that kind of mercy. Its core argument is that these men do not become kinder when the camera looks away. Off-screen ambiguity is not absolution. It is simply the show refusing to offer comfort as compensation for attention. The fascination with what happens to the Bada Bing if Tony and Silvio are removed by violence adds a final layer of realism. Street hierarchy does not automatically translate into legal ownership. A club has paperwork, corporate forms, and heirs. If the legal owners are killed or incapacitated, succession follows instruments like wills and probate, not the opinions of surviving captains. That means spouses and families, people kept mostly off-screen, suddenly matter. The very legitimate front that launders criminal cash becomes subject to unglamorous legal process, which is the kind of banal consequence this world pretends does not exist until it arrives. Even the more absurd fantasies, an inheritance redirected in a dramatic moral pivot, or ownership ceremonially handed to a politically symbolic group, work as satire of the crew's performative seriousness. These men talk about tradition and respect while improvising ethics by the hour. The notion that a will could cleanse old prejudices with a few ceremonial lines is ridiculous, which is precisely why it lands. It exposes how easily principles are treated as props until paperwork makes them inconvenient. Ultimately, Silvio Dante functions as the series' most precise rebuttal to romantic mafia archetypes. He is not a gentleman counselor. He is not a theatrical maniac. He is a competent operator who treats murder as a tool and loyalty as a job requirement. The show uses him to demonstrate how banal evil can be when it is routinized, when the man cracking jokes at the table is also the man who can calmly drive a familiar face into the woods and erase a life from the ledger. His limited personal exposure is not proof of innocence or underdevelopment. It is the show's quiet reminder that competence is not character growth. In this world, it is merely a higher grade of damage, delivered with better posture and fewer words. Competence isn't innocence. Subscribe.